Welcome everybody. This afternoon we have Carol Stevens here with us. This is a great opportunity to get a chance to see her. She's been an American Sign Language interpreter for over 52 years, was certified back in 1976, has been a guest lecturer at Catonsville Community College, founded and directed the Deaf Shalom Zone in Maryland, has worked with deaf clients from over 40 different countries. She's been an expert witness in immigration cases and has worked with lots of clients who have had severely limited language acquisition. And so she's here to talk today about just deaf individuals with limited language and how to address language deprivation. So Carol, take it away.
Thank you very much, Jen. I'm really honored and thrilled to be here with everybody to talk about something that's really special to me, and that's people who have language deprivation. As Jen said, I've been working for over 50 years with deaf people, and many people that I work with have language deprivation issues. And so that has maybe inadvertently become sort of a specialist in this area, people seem to think. I don't really want you to think that I'm the expert in this area. There are experts, though, that I'll be referring to today. One of them is Sanjay, S-A-N-J-A-Y, Gulati, G-U-L-A-T-I. He's a medical doctor, late deafened or had a progressive hearing loss. He's from Harvard. He's done a whole lot of work and research in this field. Another person is Neil Glickman, who has a real specialty in language deprivation and mental health issues connected with deaf people. And the third person is Wyatt Hall, who is himself deaf. So a lot of things I'll be talking about initially will be connected with some of their work. Then mostly I want to tell you a number of different stories, all true stories about things and people that I've worked with over the years that illustrate some of these particular aspects of language deprivation. But first, I think we need to look at the sign for language deprivation. The sign that typically is being used for language deprivation, if you want to watch me sign it, is language deprivation or language deprivation, which shows the language being pulled away from the person. But probably a more accurate interpretation or sign would be what Neil Glickman talks about. He says language deprivation. In other words, being held back, never having had language to be taken away, but having language that's been held back from you. In other words, I might use a little bit is language disfluency. It's a really difficult word to try to describe. A native signer or a person who has really a lot of near native experience with people with language deprivation can spot it. Often people who can sign well don't spot it, but you just see things that are just not quite right. And you know somehow in your gut that this is not quite the right sign. But before we get into all this, let's talk about language and what it kind of isn't. Speech isn't language. Speech is something that you do with language. It's something interesting that when most of the research has been done with kids with cochlear implants, what is generally measured is not language development, it's speech development. How many words a child can say that are understandable, how many words that they can understand, or their discrimination, speech discrimination. But speech and words are not language. Communication isn't even language. If you look at a child, an infant, and you can talk to that child and the child can communicate back to you, and often they will do a lot of babbling and they'll even put inflections in for question marks, and they'll go, blah, 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 and they'll put in all kinds of linguistic features, but it's not language as such, but they have a language inside of them that they're starting to already develop. A man named Wittgenstein back in 1922, he's a philosopher, a German philosopher. He said that the limits of my language means the limits of my world. The limits of my language means the limits of my world. Now, Gulati, the man that I spoke about before, who's a medical doctor, he's a psychiatrist. He says the single greatest risk facing deaf people is inadequate exposure to a usable first language. that is the single greatest risk, not having a usable first language. It's dangerous if you don't have a strong language base. And later on, we'll talk about some of the cases and people that I've worked with for whom language was not strong and how dangerous that was for them. If language acquisition is disrupted or doesn't happen, lots of unfortunate things happen. We tend to think about putting in language to a child auditorily, but the auditory system is faulty, so that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you've got to have a strong visual language. And some people will say, well, we'll teach the child how to lip read and speak first, and then if that doesn't work, then we'll teach them sign language. Well, the research has been done by a woman by the name of Mayberry at University of California in San Diego, and by some other people, shows that the plasticity of the brain during which time language can be learned is up to the age of 5. And that's true whether it's visual language, sign language, or spoken language. So if you're thinking about teaching a child how to learn language auditorily, and then if that fails, to use sign language, you've already passed the time when a child has that plasticity to be able to learn language in any form at all. So their ability to learn language, their language acquisition, is greatly impaired, and so they become language deprived. So I want to talk about some of those outcomes. But first, a couple other things to think about. We're all very excited if we have a child that's deaf, hard of hearing, deaf child, who learns how to speak and says a word, or even learns how to sign and says a word, and they're 3 years old, and we say, oh, how wonderful, a child has this word. Well, when that child is 23, and they still have a very, very limited little vocabulary, they're not so cute anymore. And that's the issue that is a real concern for me, is a lot of times people who are in education, they see the kids when they're little, and they're working with them when they're small, but they don't see the outcome. You don't see what that child is like when they're 23 or 33 or 63, and they still don't have much language, and they still don't know what's going on, and they're still language deprived, and their life is really messed up. So one of the big problems for me is that the people who are doing the educating of the kids don't see the really final product. And if so, I think maybe we have a different view of how drastic language deprivation is, how essential a good language development is. So a good first language is important. And when we see a deaf kid who comes from deaf parents, who has a language immersion 24/7 from birth on, we see kids that tend to be much better linguistically, much more knowledgeable about things, much better able to function. So some of the results of language deprivation is just that, the lack of being able to function well, a lower functioning level, problems with something as simple as taking a bus, what's money, using money, figuring out time, figuring out when things happen, lots of just general information. People with language deprivation often have poor social skills. They have problems with empathy. They have problems with what we refer to as theory of mind, being able to consider how other people think and feel and believe and putting themselves in somebody else's position. Having those needs or those skills are very important to having good social skills. People with language deprivation have a difficult time just telling a story. Sometimes you feel like you've been dropped from the sky into the middle of something that the person is trying to tell you. They have problems with sequencing, telling a story, what happened first, what happened second, what happened third. They have problems with things like language, with things like tenses. They don't give you a time indicator. You know how in ASL we always say, 2 weeks ago, now we know we're in the past tense. So all our verbs are automatically past tense. They don't give you a time indicator. You don't know when it happened. Did it happen yesterday? Did it happen last week? Is it going to be happening later? What's happening with time? Often a person with language deprivation doesn't give you nouns. You don't know who they're talking about. You don't know where they're talking about. You don't know what's happened. You try to get a story and you have to keep asking questions. Well, who person, man, woman, person, just to find out who the person is talking about. Sometimes they don't have general information, and they will just say, you know, and you say, no, I don't know. Who's that? They'll use a name sign, and you say, they don't know the person's name. Even family members, you may know that this is a person, but might not know that this person is their father or their uncle or their grandfather, or what the relationship is. They often have a poor use of space, of placement. Very important in ASL to be able to face concepts and ideas when we're talking about it. And often everything is just right in front of them, and you can't figure out who's doing what to whom, who's giving something to somebody else. All those kinds of movements that go along with ASL, those linguistic structures are often missing. Sometimes the facial grammar and the facial markers just aren't there, or they're not appropriate to what the person is really saying. So you get a disconnect between what the hands are trying to put out and what the face is trying to say, and the things just don't match up. All these kinds of things lead to a lot of poor problem solving for the person. Another thing that's difficult for them is the ability to think abstractly in the sense of seeing patterns. For example, we had a young guy, and all he wanted to do was steal silver Toyotas. Not a gray Toyota, not a blue Toyota, Nissan. It had to be a silver Toyota. And he was very clever, streetwise, about popping ignitions. He could pop ignitions just like that. So he would get arrested for his silver Toyota theft, come to court, and the public defender or somebody would talk, and they would get him off. They would say, well, okay, we'll drop the charges, or okay, time served. He's been in jail for 2 weeks, and we'll let him out, and that'll be it. He never got the pattern that if you steal a silver Toyota, the police are going to find you, you're going to go to court, and then you get off. Well, eventually one day a judge said, 8 times, that's it, jail, 2 years. He was amazed. I often thought if his grandmother, with whom he lived, would only bought him a silver Toyota, he could have avoided all this problem. But he didn't get the pattern. He wasn't able to think abstractly, even to that little limited extent. So when you have a severe language problems and a person doesn't have a good native language skills, there's often a lot of behavior problems that go along with it. Social relationships suffer, and they can begin very early in childhood. Often a child has problems in all kinds of domains, and adult too, at home, at school, at work. The lack of general knowledge, huge gaps of information. And often the person appears to look psychotic to people who don't know, because everything is so choppy and it's so hard to get things to make sense. Often a person who has language deprivation, whether they're school age or older, get diagnosed with ADHD, oppositional behavior disorders, all kinds of behavioral kinds of things happen because they don't have enough language to be able to figure out what's going on, to be able to do all the emotional kinds of understanding of things, to be able to have self-regulatory skills. And they often act out and can end up going to various doctors or institutions, get over-medicated, have behavior plans to try to change the behavior. But the real issue isn't the behavior. The issue is there isn't the language to be able to mediate what's going on in their world, to be able to figure out. Most people want to have a pretty good life. Most people want to be pretty good if they could just figure out how to be pretty good. But if you don't have enough language, that's a really hard thing to figure out. Dr. Gulati says that language deprivation and behavior problems are very highly correlated from his research. And people who have language deprivation are much more of a danger to themselves and to other people. There was some research that was published by Adera and showed the high correlation between the age of onset of language acquisition and substance abuse. The older the person was in developing language, the higher their correlation with substance abuse. And that after the age of 10, there was a much higher correlation that a person would be suicidal. So these are some of the serious behavior kinds of things that go on. there's one more thing I want to talk about first before the stories, and that is memory. How far back can you remember? Now, I have pretty good memories from the age of 4. I could tell you about having my tonsils out at the age of 4, and I've got this whole story that I could tell you. And that starts about age 4. And that's pretty common for people who are hearing. But over dinner one night, I sat with my 2 friends who were deaf, and I asked them about this question. Because as a therapist, I was having problems getting early memories from patients that I was working with. It's pretty common for therapists to want to know, well, what happened in your childhood and all this. And I had a real hard time getting that information. So my one friend, Caroline, talked about having gone to oral school until she was 9. And then she went to a deaf school when she started learning ASL. And she could remember back, and the earliest she could remember back was the age of 8, about 1 year before she started to learn sign language, or an effective language for her. Prior to that, she has only very, very vague memories. But even wilder was her husband, Sam. Sam had gone to an oral school, and he quit at the age of 14. At the oral school, of course, they were speaking English. But at home, his Italian family was speaking Italian. Well, nobody told him that there were 2 different languages. Nobody told him anything that he could understand. So when he quit school at the age of 14, that was it for education. But 2 years later, he met this deaf guy named Victor. And as he said it, Victor saved my life. Victor took him to the deaf club, and there he learned sign language. So I said to Sam, how far back can you remember? And he said, oh, I remember some things from when I was 15. 15. He had almost no memories of anything prior to the age of 15. But he had no language that was effective until he was 16. And he could have those words to tag on to those more recent memories that he had, be able to rehearse and to think about things. Because when you think about your memories, you kind of think in some kind of a language form. Deaf people tell me they think sometimes in signs. Hearing people seem to think in words. People think in different kinds of ways, but you have tags, language tags to put onto those memories. So that's an important thing to think about when you think about our children and how much do they really remember about what's going on? How much can they really even learn if they don't have good, strong language, first language, to be able to do the memory, the remembering with? Now some stories. I love stories. So I'd like to share with you some stories of things that I've experienced with people either in court situations, hospitals, or as a therapist. Now I've changed the names and the genders, the locations, anything that could be identifying. So if you think you know who I'm talking about, you don't. Everything has been changed to protect the innocent and the guilty. The first is a traumatic memory that was recently posted on Facebook. So this one isn't confidential at all. It was about a young boy who is himself, who was 6 years old when this happened. And he didn't understand a sign that a deaf person who was fluent in sign language was giving him. So he had the language deprivation problem. He didn't have enough language. The person who was talking to him had good language in sign language. And Stanley says he was language deprived, but eventually he graduated from the deaf school and he went to Gallaudet and graduated from Gallaudet. And this is the story he tells. When he was 4, he went to school, to the state school for the deaf. And when he was 6, one night, he got up to go to the bathroom. When he was supposed to be going back to his bed, he started just playing around and not paying attention. And this dorm mother spotted him and said, come here, you're supposed to be in bed. And he said he was just in the bathroom. And she signed him, if you want to watch how I'm going to sign, she signed to him. He took that to mean marry. Now, what she was doing was a very little imperceptible shaking her head no and signing believe, that she didn't believe him. But she signed believe from down near her cheek, not from up at her head, but from her cheek, which looked an awful lot like Mary. His language wasn't developed enough for him to notice the little imperceptible negative head nod and the facial expression that she was giving him. So he thought that she was propositioning him, that she wanted to marry him. And he was petrified that this lady that he thought was like a mother to him was wanting to get married to him. Here's another different example where a child has not very good language and has an adult who has even worse language. This is a girl who was 16 years old, and she was referred to me for therapy because this girl, who was only about 4'10", was so frustrated and angry because she didn't have good language. She didn't have good impulse control because of that. She did not understand a lot of things that were going on. And she would beat up her teachers because she gets so frustrated. So they sent her to me. I was at her house one time, and her mother was talking to her. Her mother had very limited signs. And her mother said to her, "Do you want some pie?" But this is how the mother signed it. Instead of you want pie, mother said, "You," those of you who know sign language, is "you vagina." I often thought, what does this poor little girl do all the time when her mother is communicating with her, trying to decipher these strange signs that her mother is giving her, and what does she really mean? And I often think, how much do our kids think, who are learning sign language, who get these home signs and gestures and strange things at home to try to figure out, is this a language? They don't know really that it's home signs. They don't know what it is, and they're trying to decipher it. Here's a story about another deaf child. This is a story that's got some devastating repercussions. Unintended maybe initially, but this is what happened. This is a 6-year-old or 7-year-old deaf autistic boy who was black, deaf, autistic boy. He was adored by his single mom, who was a student at college and studying to be a nurse. His father had recently died in an automobile accident. He showed up at school with a 2-inch long scratch on his neck. Now, the school people were mandatory reporters. But kids show up at school with scratches and bruises all the time. If my teachers reported me or reported my mother every time I showed up to school with a bruise or a scratch, it would have been really bad. And I'm sure that's true of a lot of us. So as mandatory reporters, we make judgment calls about what's just kids and what's something that actually happened as far as an abuse situation or what we think might be an abuse situation. This has some really serious things to consider. What happens to a child who is African American, poor, inner city, single mom, compared to a cute little white girl with blonde hair and blue eyes from suburbia? How much of those kinds of biases come into our decision about what we report and what we don't report? Well, this child's teacher reported this to the Department of Social Service. Protective Service came out, and I imagine that the teacher said to Protective Services, he's deaf, maybe he said he's autistic, and off the child went with a PS worker, no interpreter. They pile into the car and they drive 25 miles or so into town. They go to a big teaching hospital. They use the video interpreter, the TV screen, not a live interpreter, to communicate with this little boy. Meanwhile, the police are called, and the police bring the mother into the hospital and have her sit in the waiting room. The social worker tries to get the story from the child using the video interpreter. Now, this little guy has probably never had an interpreter, but he certainly has not had a video interpreter before. So the social worker asks through the video interpreter, "What happened? What happened to your neck?" And he signs this: "Mother, mother, mother." The interpreter says, "Mother, mother, mother." So the social worker thinks, oh, his mother did something to him. So she took a big jump at what that meaning for the word mother meant, that the mother did it. Well, then she wanted to know, well, how did the mother do this? What happened? So she tried to get this story. Well, he didn't have enough language to give much of a story. So he doesn't know what they're doing. He's petrified. So the social worker says, was it a knife? And the interpreter signs knife. And the boy echoes back, knife. Echolalia is a copying of a spoken word or a copying of a sound or a sign. So a child or an adult with language deprivation will often just copy what a sign is. So the interpreter signs knife, and he says, knife, knife, knife. Social worker thinks mom took a knife to his neck and made this slash in his neck. Then police get the mother, arrest her. The social worker takes the little boy, and the mother goes to jail, and the little boy goes into shelter care. This is a Friday afternoon. Goes into shelter care, which is an emergency foster care placement over the weekend while they try to figure out what to do. Monday, the grandparents of the child, the mother's parents, and the child and the social worker go to family court. At family court, there's an emergency hearing to decide what they're going to do with the child. They decide, the judge decides to have the child go and live with the grandparents who don't know any sign language. The mother has gone through the court process enough to be told that she can be released, but she cannot have any contact with the child until they come back for the court hearing in about a month. So the mother has no contact with the child. Nobody can communicate with the child. A week later, they come back into court, family court again, at which point the judge says to the grandparents, well, have you take the child. The mother is also there. And she says, unfortunately, although I don't think this is really an issue, the criminal court people have said you cannot have contact with the child till after court. So after court, you can start your criminal court. After criminal court, you can have contact with the child as far as I'm concerned, depending on what they decide. So the child goes with the grandparents. The mother doesn't have any contact. She's very obedient. You go into court a month later, criminal court, and the mother is asked, do you want to plead guilty? She said, no, I'm not guilty. I didn't do anything. Besides, she's studying to be a nurse. How is she going to get a job as a nurse with a record of child abuse, a felony conviction of child abuse on a record? No way. So she says, no, she would not take a plea. So since it's a felony, it gets remanded down to circuit court. Circuit court does the arraignment, and then 3 months later is the case. Finally, after 6 months almost, the case finally comes in, and the state's attorney says, nah, this isn't a case, I'm going to drop it. The whole case gets dropped, and the mother can have contact with the child 6 months after this incident happened. The child has been taken away from the mother from the child, placed in an environment with no sign language, taken out of his good school placement, placed into an inferior school placement. They're not going to overreact and have protective services come in. So sometimes the consequences are very drastic, very devastating. Here's a story about a guy. Now he was 16 years old. This is back in 1980, so it's been a while. I got a phone call, and the request was for me to go to interpret for a public defender for a deaf 16-year-old boy who had been arrested. And I was to go there, and there was going to be another interpreter there. So there's another seasoned interpreter and I to do this. We went to the juvenile detention center, and we had no idea how challenging this was going to be. So here is Ernie. He's 16 years old and sitting in the corner. He's a wild-eyed little boy. And there's a public defender who is very caring and very bright, and he was excellent to work with. He gave us some information from the charging documents, but not a whole lot because he wanted to get the story from the boy. So all that we really knew was his name, his address, which was in the inner city, and his age. We also knew that he had been arrested with another boy who was 14 years old and who was hearing. Apparently, Ernie had gone to a school in the city, which had a very inferior deaf program with very limited sign language, which I knew from my experience in the community. he appeared to be intellectually limited, but it's really difficult to know if a person's intellectually limited or not when they have language deprivation, because you don't know what's causing what. The only way you could know that would be have a psychologist who's really versed in testing people who are deaf with language deprivation to be able to be sure what was going on. Well, we two interpreters struggled like crazy to try to piece together what the story was with the very rudimentary signs that Ernie had. So here's part of his story. So watch me now for his story. This is what he signed. Let me do that now with some voice. Me, go, boy, father, Harlm. Boy, father, me, walk. Sit down, put something thin and small, and then this. Well, there was a whole lot of pantomime and gestures and drawing, and the two interpreters were going crazy until we finally figured out what we thought was the story. And we agreed that what we thought was this, that Ernie's explanation was that I went to boy, father, Harlem. Boy, father, Harlem. Many, many deaf people who have language deprivation use father to refer to any adult male. Okay. So boy, father, Harlem's house was his uncle's house. And I'll tell you how we got there, on Harlem Avenue. And I went with my boy cousin, and the two of us walked and walked. We went to a payphone booth, sat down, put money in the payphone booth slot, took the receiver off the hook, and talked on the phone. Now, it took a long time to figure this out. It was a long process that required all kinds of drawings and lots of imagination from Ernie and from us, and lots of patience and restraint from the public defender. It was quite a trip. You just can't jump to conclusions about what meaning is with this crowd. You have to be really diligent to figure it out. So here's how we figured it out. Me go, I went. That was easy. Boy, father, Harlm. Boy, father, Harlem would be boy, father, could be any adult male. Harlem, Harl. I knew from that area where he lived that there was a street named Harlem Avenue. Boy, father, Harlem, when he meant it's a boy that was related to a man who lived on Harlem Avenue. So then he said that they walked and they went and he sat down. He sat down and we drew pictures now. He had taken a coin out of his pocket, put it into a payphone booth slot, and then put the receiver up to his mouth and talked, which of course is pretty bizarre for a deaf kid to be doing, but that's what his story was. And it took us a long time to be sure that that's what the story really was, or to these hope that we were sure that that's what the story was. And I think that's another part of the lesson of all this, is that you can never be sure 100% that you got the story right. You try your very, very best, but it's hard to be 100% sure. But over the next couple of days of working with him and the public defender, we felt like we had a pretty good story. And the story that was written on the charging documents corresponded with what we were coming up with. Here's another woman, Molly. She's 30 years old and deaf. She was in a state hospital for what was then called mentally retarded. And she was required to be a witness in a trial of a staff person who was accused of raping her and another woman who was a patient there. Now, the public defender, the state's attorney, her attorney, knew that Molly would be a sympathetic victim, but she also knew that Molly's deafness and her cognitive limitations might make her a very unpredictable witness. And if she were to take the stand, that during the trial, which would be full of strangers and be in front of the accused rapist, it was unpredictable what she might do. So the state attorney arranged for me to come to the courtroom a few days before the case so that we could get the story from Molly. So I said, I'd only do it if I brought another seasoned interpreter and a deaf woman along with me, so we could just work together to get this story, because I knew this was going to be rough. So we get to the courtroom, and I had very little information to go on. It seemed like this little girl or this woman had been faced when she was a little girl of 4 in this institution and had no effective sign language. But she was one expert actress. Boy, could she act out a story. So after she saw the mugshot of the man who was accused of raping her, and with a little bit of encouragement from me, she started to act out the rape. And so she had all these blonde curls and these big bushy eyebrows and these big green eyes. And for a while, about 30 minutes, we acted out the rape. Sometimes Molly was herself and I was a rapist. Sometimes I was Molly and she was a rapist. And by the time we got finished, Molly was screaming and crying on the floor. I was about to scream and cry myself, but there was no doubt about what had happened. Her acting out the story was very, very clear. I had visions of the next couple of days that we were going to end up in court with me rolling around on the floor with Molly, trying to act out this rape in front of the rapist and the judge and the jury. But the state's attorney had a better idea. She called up the defense attorney and she proceeded to tell him exactly what Molly was going to do in court and how she could act out the whole story. And the next day, the defense attorney, after speaking with the defendant, called and said he decided to take a plea and to admit to guilt, which was a great relief to me because it would have been a real rough day in court as she acted everything out. She didn't have language to be able to tell you this story, but she knew what the story was and she could act it out. It required a lot of time and patience and creativity. We got this story. She couldn't say that she was raped. She couldn't say hardly anything at all, but she knew that this was a bad man and he had hurt her and it was wrong and she was not happy and she could tell you exactly what happened. And she left no doubt in anybody's mind about what was going on. Here's a story about the dangers of the lack of knowledge, the lack of being able to do abstract thinking, the problems that happen when you just don't have information. I got a call from a psychiatric to do a psychiatric evaluation on Davy, who was a 29-year-old deaf guy, because he was suicidal and he was in a state psychiatric hospital. So when I arrived, I read the scanty record and it was very scanty. And I realized that this was going to be not a typical evaluation. The record revealed that 2 days earlier, he had tried to hang himself from a 6-foot-high dumpster outside the day program that he went to. So I got more information from the agency that he was connected with and from his parents. And I found out that Davy had been deaf and cognitively limited probably since about the age of 9 months when he had spinal meningitis. He'd grown up on a farm with his loving parents, and they had tried to get him an education, but everybody said, he's too retarded. Now, this was back before kids were going to school like they do now. So this is maybe 1985, something, 1990. So he finally went to this group home program for hearing people. We, at that time, had no group home programs for deaf people. And he went to their day program. And what he had learned was to be quiet and nice and smile and watch TV, which he did. He loved to watch Westerns on TV, and that's what he did pretty much all day long. He also liked his young caseworker, his young woman who worked with him at the day program named Karen. And Karen was a very kind, sweet young girl who was very kind to him. But one afternoon after lunch, Karen looked out the window of her office to see Davy hanging with one rope around, one end of the rope around his neck and one end of the rope around the dumpster. Everyone panicked, of course. It was just so unlike Davy to do something like this. They had not suspected he was depressed or anything. And so they panicked and he got him down and he took him to the emergency room. Well, the emergency room people, they said, oh, he's suicidal. So they sent him out to the state hospital. And then the state hospital got a hold of me. So when I saw him, I was really touched by his big, sad, droopy puppy dog eyes. He tried to communicate, and this is what Davy signed. You can watch me now. Friend, that was Karen's name signed. No. Karen, cry. Home? Yes. I drew a picture of Davy with a rope around his neck in a dumpster. And he sat there and just sadly looked up and nodded his head up and down. But then I thought, I got to get more of this story. So I called his parents again. I talked with them. And they said that on the farm, that they had never allowed him to see anything die. So although animals had died around in the farm, he had never seen that. So they didn't think that he had any real understanding about that. And he really didn't seem to have any understanding about that when he would be watching TV things on TV. You would watch the TV cowboys being hung in a movie, but the next day they were back in another movie. So what's being hung? Seeing is believing. And if you don't know what's reality and what's fantasy, if you don't know that TV is not real, but it's a story, or maybe it is real, maybe it's a documentary. What is it? What do our kids think when they're watching TV and they see cartoons? Do they think that there's a place like that with people like that? How do they know what's reality and what's not? Well, Davy didn't know what was reality and what wasn't. He thought that this guy would get hanged today and be back in the movie tomorrow. So after a week of observing him, he was discharged to go back to the day program, to his group home. Well, Davy wasn't suicidal because he'd sure been dead. So now what was I going to do with him? To try to get him some understanding about death, to try to keep him from killing himself or doing something else. He didn't have enough language for us to be able to talk about death, about dying. He could very easily have been dead, but what was my therapy going to be like with him? I decided the only way to do it was to try to give him an experience of what death was. It had to be experiential. So I planned out what I referred to as my trip to death. I made arrangements with the hospital and funeral home that Davy and I would come and we would have a trip to death and maybe we could experience it that way. So first we went to the hospital emergency room and I gestured to him, to the people. I pointed to different people and held my head and my stomach like this. They looked like I was sick, and shook my head. And then I pointed to some people and I said, thumbs up, home. Pointed to other people and I said, thumbs down, upstairs. So we went upstairs to ICU. We get up to ICU and I pointed to some people and said, sick, thumbs up, go home. Other people, sick, thumbs down, breathing, and then breathing stop. Put my arms across my chest like this, sign dead. Not that I thought he understood dead. Then we left there and got in my car and we went to the funeral home. The local funeral home director let us come in before the regular viewing. And we went there. There was a young man about Davy's age in a casket. So the two of us go over and we shake him. I shake him first. He won't wake up. So I said to Davy, you shake him. He shook him. He wouldn't wake up. We looked at the casket. I said, dead, dead. Mother, cry. Father, cry. Dead. Then I gestured to Davy and I showed him a picture of him with the rope around his neck. And I said, you, dead. Same as him, dead. Mother, cry. Father, cry. Karen, cry. Carol, cry. I put my very, very biggest sad face and I said, no, 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 no. Back in the car we go. We drive to the cemetery. We walk over the graves, the little lumps, and I'm pointing to it and I'm gesturing, dead. And I'm thinking, this isn't working. Finally, a funeral procession comes in. We go to the plot. Davy and I stay in back, so a respectable distance. We watch as they bring the casket out, and the family comes, and people are crying. And they go and they pray, and the people leave, and they're crying. We stand there and wait, and we watch as the men at the cemetery lower the casket, and then put dirt over the casket. and I'm signing sad, die. I still don't know what Davy's getting of all this. We get in the car. I drive back to the day program. I tell Karen what happened. We both look at each other and still don't know what's happening on our day of death. So a week later, I get this excited phone call from Karen. And she says to me, something wonderful happened. Something wonderful happened. I said, why? What happened? She said, well, a bird flew into the side of the building, into the window, and dropped down dead. And Davy went out and he saw it and he said, oh, sad. And he made the sign of the cross. He said, sad, sad bird, sad. Well, I had never made the sign of the cross with him. So we thought, well, he understood something. We still are not sure what he understood, but he seemed to understand something. Well, he's never tried to commit suicide since then. He's now living in a deaf group home. He's got a little bit more language. He's still super language deprived, but he's got more language and he's functioning and he's a lot happier and is doing much better than he was. Got a request for another situation. There was a deaf defendant and his lawyer was going to meet with him and wanted me, I was asked to come to be the interpreter. All that I knew is that the guy was deaf and slow, but the public defender for the county was really good. This was a guy who did cases of people who had all kinds of special needs, mental illness, cognitive limitations. He was excellent. He'd gotten all kinds of information about this guy, about his history, his family, his schooling, the charges, everything. So he knew what the case was before we went in. So we started. And all the police information and charging documents and all the information that he had gotten gave us this information. That Gerald, who was 21 years old, had been deaf since birth, or very early in his life. He had been arrested and charged with sexually abusing several minors in one incident. The victims were a group of 5 hearing boys ages 14 to 16. And Gerald, who was 21, drove a van. You okay there? All right. Gerald, who was 21, drove a van, and boys had befriended Gerald because he was their transportation. He was their transportation to get to the mall, to get to the bowling alley. So they liked Gerald because he was his wheels. Now, don't ask me how Gerald got a license. No clue. Somehow Gerald got a license because he couldn't read or write. I have no clue, but he had a license and a car. He also worked in a grocery store. Well, on one of these frequent drives that they all took, this group of boys all started doing some homosexual exploration. And Gerald was involved in it, like they all were. And one of the boys had told his parents about it, and that's why the charges were generated. So the public defender also had found out that Gerald had attended a communications disordered class in the county, which I knew from my experience was a catch-all class for students with multiple severe issues, such as autism and cognitive limitations and auditory processing and just any kind of thing that had to do with language processing. And the kids were put in there, and he was in this class. Now, this was in the late 80s. Now, Gerald would probably have been treated better than that academically, but he still would have probably been as language deprived as he was when I saw him. There was no sign of language that was being used to teach the kids in this class. Gerald's mother couldn't sign, so there's no communication at home. He had picked up about 200 signs someplace, and he would gesture to communicate his basic needs. So Gerald, the story that the attorney was able to piece together was pretty clear. And so that was the story, that they were out and had been exploring each other sexually, and Gerald got arrested. Gerald looked scared and confused when we tried to communicate with him, but he was pleasant. As a public defender, and I tried to explain to him the consequences of his behavior. And this was serious stuff. So Gerald and I, he was an adult, and this was a group of boys. Well, Gerald and I, we drew pictures of the van and the boys, and I acted things out. He acted things out, and I was trying to explain to him what he was accused of doing. Gerald would just smile and he would sign quietly, my friends, my friends. And that was it. I thought, how are we ever going to explain to him that the other boys could be involved in this homosexual exploration because they were 14 to 15, 16. But he was over 18. He was an adult. Now we got a whole different things. The rules were different for him. He didn't know there were any rules. They were his friends. They were his peers. I drew pictures of the jail. I had a grate that I held up to try to show him about the jail. Finally, he started to cry. I wasn't quite sure why he was crying, but something had gotten through and he was crying. But I knew that he really didn't understand it very well. Well, it was very obvious that with this 200-word vocabulary and this little bit of language, trying to get him to communicate anything more was not going to work out. The public defender and I looked at each other in dismay because how are we going to go to court with this boy? The families were all enraged. How is this ever going to work out? The public defender knew that the families would be just furious about what was going on. But he was stuck with trying to defend Gerald, and that was his client. And Gerald didn't have enough language to be able to participate in his own defense. So the lawyer and I did talk, and the lawyer said, well, we'll go into court. We'll ask for a postponement of 6 months so he can develop enough language to participate in his own defense. I said, no way. In 6 months, he'll never have enough language. Maybe he will never, ever have enough language to participate in his own defense. But I said, yeah, I know that. But by that time, things will have calmed down and we'll be able to get through this case a lot easier. So I said, okay. So off we went to court. I can remember it was a really hot day in August. We stood there in the courtroom. The public defender and Gerald were on one side of the table. I was on the other side of the table with my back to the judge. And the state's attorney had been talked to by this defense attorney, and he was sympathetic to having a continuance, having a postponement. So I'm there interpreting what's going on to Gerald. Of course, I'm moving it way down to a very simplistic level, hoping he's going to understand something of what I'm saying. But I realize all the people in the courtroom think that I'm interpreting what they're saying. They think I'm word for word explaining what's going on in court. When we're saying he doesn't understand enough to participate in his own defense, that just isn't going to work. So I decided I'm going to have to voice what I'm signing so they know what Gerald's really getting. So I started to voice out loud what I was signing, and I signed this. Black dress man, and pointing to Judge Waters, boss. Judge Waters started to giggle when he interrupted. He said, I'm sorry, Miss Stevens. You've been in front of me a lot of times, and I know you will. I've been on the bench a long time, but I've never been called black dress man, boss before. Well, the case got postponed, and when we got back into court, the parents weren't there, things had calmed down. And prior to that, he was placed on supervision, which means he had to go to pretrial. And so he went to the pretrial person, and he thought that person is his new friend. And the new friend brought in an interpreter. So now he had two new friends, an interpreter. He must have had a hard job ever explaining anything to Gerald. And the public and the pretrial release supervisor, who gave him a very favorable report because he showed up every time and he was cooperative and nice. And finally, what happened was he was given a stet, which means there was no finding of guilt or not guilty. It was just all like put on a hold indefinitely unless he got into trouble again. So being denied language, Gerald was extremely vulnerable. He had no deaf community to relate to. He had no friends. He didn't know, I don't know if he ever met any deaf person. And he could have very easily been spending the rest of his life in prison. So it was damaging to him. It was damaging to the boys. Sometimes a person has had language and then has had the language actually removed from them. That kind of being language deprived. That happens when somebody becomes extremely isolated. What happens is the plasticity of the hippocampus, which is the part of your brain that has to do with memory and emotions, but particularly with memory. Their neurons start to die off and that's the area where more neurons are made. So more neurons are not made, so the functioning of the hippocampus gets decreased, so the ability to remember things gets decreased. There's been some research that's been done on mice. You can't do a whole lot of research on people by isolating like this, although some has been done with people who have been in solitary confinement in jail. But with mice, when they're in social isolation for a month, they lose 20% of their neurons in their brain. So if that happens to mice, it probably happens to humans. Exactly the percent and how long and how much is hard to say, but it certainly happens. Well, this is what happened. The deaf community outreach worker at the agency where I worked had gone out to visit a deaf woman that was referred to us by the County Department of Social Services. She was staying in a boarding home, and when the worker came back, she said to me, "You will never believe this. This woman is in fetal position, in bed. She gets up occasionally to go to the dining room to eat or to sit in a chair. And other than that, nothing." People thought that maybe she was deaf, but they weren't sure. And they thought that maybe she was 60, but they weren't sure. But they sure knew that she was unreachable. So after a few more home visits, the outreach worker said, "I think maybe there's a glimmer in Georgia's eye. I think maybe she's recognizing me. I'm going to bring her into the senior citizen meeting that we had every week." Well, this was no easy task because Georgia hadn't been out of the house to go to the doctors, let alone to some social gathering. So she shows up at the senior group, and one old lady who's about 80 years old, who's like the social worker, Gladys, she said, "I think I remember her." Now, Gladys had deaf children who at this age were about 60, about the same age as Georgia. And she had become like the social worker for the kids when they got out of school. She was the one who helped them to learn how to live, how to take care of their life, how to be responsible, how to do money, those kinds of things. So she remembered Georgia, at least she thought so. Now, this was 40 years later. So she goes up to Georgia and she says, and signs Georgia's name sign to her. Georgia seemed to be recognizing something. Well, we weren't quite sure, but we kept bringing her back to the senior center while we kept doing some more research. And this is what we pieced together of her story, that she'd gone to the deaf school and had been in a special class for slow students. She was the only child of hearing parents, and after she was graduated from the special class, she went back home with her parents. Shortly thereafter, her parents both died, and so here was Georgia. She was placed in a succession of boarding homes. Nobody knows quite what or where or how. So she finally ended up in the boarding home where she was living when she was referred to us. She hadn't been able to read very much, so nobody could give a right to her to be able to understand anything. So she was really languageless from the time her parents died. So how much she had lost during that time is real difficult to say. But she was then placed into a group home with another deaf woman who had been in the state hospital for people who were mentally retarded. And the two of them took care of each other. And she could communicate on a basic level. And she enjoyed her stuffed animals and her chocolate milk, and she loved to hold babies. Her eyes exploded with delight when we went on a picnic and she roasted a marshmallow, and she ate her first roasted marshmallow that she made herself. And she almost fell over when I took her to Valley View to see the Christmas decorations and all the Christmas trees. So she got something of her life back, something of her language back, and she was happy, and she brought joy to other people. She was a neat lady. Another lady is Mary Jo, who is now in a deaf group home and loving her life. She's learned to crochet. She makes lots of gifts to give people with her crocheting, and she's pretty good. She loves Christmas. She loves her birthday, mostly because people give her gifts and money. She doesn't have a whole lot of social skills to deal with a lot of frustration, but she's very sweet and kind, and that way she's got some social skills. But that's a far cry from her life when she was growing up. Her father was an alcoholic and was out of the family most of the time. Her mother was mentally ill, maybe psychotic. and she was a caregiver. The extended family have told me this story about when they were children growing up, and they knew about Mary Jo, but they didn't have any power to do anything about it. Nobody was helping Mary Jo, they said. But this is what they said happened with Mary Jo. They said she may have gone to school a couple of days in her life, but they don't think so. They're not real sure. She grew up, excuse me, she grew up in a chicken coop behind the house where her mother and sister lived. Her mother had put her out there and kept her there and fed her applesauce and cold cereal until her mother died when she was 40 years old. Finally, somebody found Mary Jo, and the Department of Social Service got involved. For the last 30 years, she's lived in a deaf group home where she's learned sign language and she's become a person. When I moved from Baltimore 13 years ago, I was given a going away party. It was around Christmas time, and Mary Jo came to me and she signed, sad, sad, sorry, leave, sad. And then she looked at her necklace and she looked at me. And she looked at her necklace and looked at me. And she took off her necklace and put it around my neck. So it's one of my most cherished possessions, my necklace from Mary Jo. Very sweet lady. The final story I want to tell you is a kind of long and complicated story, but it shows you the consequences of language deprivation, not only to the deaf person, but also to society. I had previously been hired to review a videotape of a deaf woman being interviewed by the homicide unit in a neighboring jurisdiction. They had used as an interpreter a police officer who had dated a deaf girl 10 years prior. That qualifies you to be an interpreter, huh? All you who've gone to interpreter training programs and taught in interpreter training programs, get a cop who's got a deaf girlfriend from 10 years ago to interpret. Anyway, the interview was ridiculous. I mean, it was just unbelievable. He could barely communicate anything with this woman. And she was a witness of a murder. Not to mention the fact, of course, the conflict of interest of using a cop to interpret for an interview for the police. That police department in that county, that department that was doing that interview was in the county where the victim's body was found. But the actual murder had taken place in an adjacent county. And the police in that adjacent county wanted to interview the witness, this deaf woman, but they wanted to do it right. They got a hold of me, and I told them that I had seen the earlier interview that was on the video. And I told them that the woman was very limited language. And if I was going to do this, there were certain things that I would require. And this is what I required. I required a certified deaf interpreter of my choosing. I wanted somebody that I knew would be patient and thorough and careful and have a good relationship with her and that we would work well together. I wanted somebody that I knew was not going to be jumping to conclusions about what the meanings of things were. That's the biggest danger about interpreting. And let me do a little side thing here. When you're an interpreter, what you do is you take information in, you see what somebody's signing to you, you make sense out of it, and then you say what it is. Well, sometimes what you're taking in, since that's what you're trying to do is make sense of it, sometimes it doesn't make as much sense of it as you think you're making sense of it. Do you know what I mean? You're giving meaning to things that you're not really sure of. You have to be real careful that you really have the story right. You can't just be taking in information and spitting it out and taking it in and spitting it out, especially with people with language deprivation, because you're not getting a straight story. You're getting things with verbs and tenses all messed up. You're getting no nouns. You're getting placements of things all over the place. You're getting stories where the beginning's at the end and the end's at the beginning, and the consequential stuff is thrown in. Important things are left out. So you can't just do the regular old interpreting thing of just seeing it and putting it out. You've got to be real, real careful. So I wanted to be sure that I had a good CDI to work with me to get the story. I wanted to be sure that the police understood that this is going to be taking a long time and that they're going to have to be real careful about things. I wanted to be sure that I had pictures of everything that we could possibly get pictures of the scene, the defendant, the victim, everything. I wanted to also be sure that they had Valerie, the deaf woman, wear a light colored blouse so that her dark hands would show up. In the first videotape, she had on a navy blouse. You couldn't see her hands, not to mention the fact that the video equipment that they had done it on was a good 15 feet away from her, so they were so small you couldn't have seen them anyway, and it wasn't set up properly. I wanted to have control over how things were being videotaped so that they would get a good story, and I wanted to have two cameras going, one on Valerie and the CDI, what they were doing, and one on me. And then I wanted it produced in such a way that the two things were next to each other, like what you're seeing now, like a split screen. So, and I felt like I had the right, because I knew what was going on or what could be going on much better than the police did. I knew what was needed to make this work. And sometimes as the interpreter, you know what's needed. You sometimes are the only person in the room who knows what's really going on. So you have a responsibility ethically to to be empowered to do the right thing to make sure that things work out and not to go through the motions and say, well, I've done this now and I can go home. I don't know about you. I can't sleep with myself at night if I know that I have done a poor job at getting the information correctly. So the day of the interview, Jane, the CDI, and I arrived early because we want to discuss with the homicide unit about what they feel is appropriate for us to know. And we want to get the room set up properly. So we found out that Valerie was deaf and 40 years old. They'd gone to a local school program that I knew about for girls. It was a school program that was for girls who were slow. The whole school was for girls who were slow. But they had a couple of classes for deaf girls who were considered slow. Oh, probably not slow. Language deprived for sure. I had met several of these women in the past, so I knew what their language looked like. It wasn't a whole lot. So I knew that she was not going to have a whole lot of sign language to work with. Then Jane and I arranged the room. And the way we arranged the room was a long table, rectangular table. So Jane sat on one side of the table with the homicide police sitting next to her. Valerie sat at the other short end of the table so that Valerie and Jane could see each other. I sat across from the homicide detective and back so that Valerie wouldn't be distracted and look at me. People have language deprivation. Anybody really can be pretty easily distracted. And so you don't want to have distractions that are going to compound the problem that you're already going to have. So I could sign the questions from the homicide detective to Jane, and she would then sign them to Valerie. Jane could easily see me, and so that was going to work out pretty well. The two video cameras were set up okay. So then Valerie comes into the room with her sister and the plainclothes detective, and she's wearing her light blue dress. Everything's all set up. Jane and I and the homicide interviewer in plain clothes, so she wouldn't be any more intimidating than necessary, go over to Valerie to greet her. And we sign our first names, give her a name sign. We ask her what her name is, no response. So you don't know if she doesn't understand the question or if she's just too petrified to respond. Then Jane started to establish a relationship with her, but I still held back because I wanted relationship to be with Jane, not to be with me. I didn't want her to have a relationship with me particularly. So when Valerie had a hard time spelling her name, I thought this is going to be a rough day. Jane and I looked at each other and we thought, not a good day. So the homicide investigator was really excellent. He was very gentle. He was cooperative with us. He had all the pictures, everything that we needed. He was sequential in trying to ask the questions so we could try to get the story straight. Well prepared. He was very patient, because if we were going to get a story, it was going to have to be with a lot of patience. We used lots of photos of people, all kinds of things. The house where Valerie lived, which was the house where the murder took place, and the other scenes for the crime. We used drawings that Jane made, Valerie acting out the murder, and the story was becoming clearer. The whole process took from 10 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a short lunch break. And it was a long day. Now, this is what the police had thought. The police had thought that there were 2 men and Valerie in the house, and that one man, the 2 men, had got into a fight. The fight had escalated, and the one man had violently beaten up the other man and killed him. And that he had then wrapped the body in plastic, put it in a car, and taken it across the county lines to another county and set the body on fire to try to destroy the evidence. That was the police's understanding about what had happened. So then they arrested the first man for killing the second man. Now, we didn't have that story to go on. So we were trying to get the story from Valerie about what happened. And her story was somewhat different. She had witnessed the 2 men fighting. And there was the man that she signed this way. Father, remember father, that's any man, not your father. Father, tall and big. The victim, she signed as father, short, big hair. Her communication was really limited. This is what we got, as much as we could get. That the 2 men, father, big, and father, small, big hair, got into a fight. And they were fighting. And father, and she kept signing father. We knew there were these 2 men. She kept talking about this father, the big man, the father, the small man, big hair. And then she'd say, father. And after seeing this several times, I thought, there's something going on there. Maybe, what is that? Did she keep saying father, father? So I signed to Jane, father, like, what's this? And then she would sign like, go. So Jane tried to find out what this was. Found out there was a 3rd person, a 3rd man in this scene. Yes, there was father, big father. And there was father, small father, big hair, who got killed. But there's also father, and father was the one who had killed father, short, big hair. Not father, big, tall. Father, short, big hair was killed by father. He apparently had on a shirt with a logo or a name or something on it. And that was the guy who had done the murder. Not father, big guy. He wasn't the one who had done the murder. He had taken the body, wrapped it in a rug or in plastic, and taken it to another place and burned the body. He had done that, but he had not actually done the murder. It took a lot of work. You often wonder what in the world was going on in Valerie's mind when she was seeing all this, or when she was trying to explain it. What did she understand of murder, about living, about dying, about police, about court, about jail? Did she have any concept of any of that stuff? But she didn't have a lot of language, but just like some of the other people, she knew what she saw. She knew what she had experienced. And she was able to then take that language that she didn't have, take that experience that she had seen, and be able to put it out with a whole lot of effort on her part. And to the surprise of everybody, she was able to finger the person that they didn't know who was the real murderer. So this language stuff is dangerous stuff. It's important stuff. It's not something to be thought of kind of casually. I've given you some stories of things, but there are lots of other stories of lots of people with maybe not as drastic consequences, but they're probably just as drastic to that person. They're just as drastic as the cute little girl who fingers fell to her father raped because she didn't have any sign for intercourse when she had actually had consensual sex with 3 deaf boys. And these 3 deaf guys were going to get arrested for rape and put away forever because she knew how to spell rape. But that's all she knew how to spell. And 3 days of interviews with the Baltimore City police detective before we finally all felt comfortable that there's consensual sex. All kinds of serious things can go on in people's lives. And to them, even if it might not seem as consequential as some of these stories, it's pretty consequential stuff. So when you're thinking about language, you want to do things like you want to get deaf people who are fluent in the language to be role models, not just role models to drop in a couple hours a day to your class, to be hired to be paras in the class, to be hired to be teachers in the class if they're trained to be teachers, to be the language people. If your hippocampus isn't working and deteriorates because of lack of language, and you're not getting more neurons or as many neurons because of deterioration of the hippocampus, where memories are stored, how well are you going to be able to remember anything that your children are being taught? How well will a child be able to remember anything that they're being taught if their hippocampus is not working well? Language is essential to all that stuff. Good, strong, early language. Not just so they don't end up like some of these stories, but so they end up having a good life, a life that is full of joy, and a life that's full of all the good stuff and the bad stuff that we all have to deal with. I've enjoyed telling you all these kinds of things. There's going to be a resource paper that will be sent out to you tomorrow that has videotapes, links to videotapes by Wyatt, by Neil Blickman, Wyatt Hall, Neil Blickman, Sanjay Gulati, a book by Neil Blickman. There's also on there a resource. There's a Center for Atypical Language Interpretation at Northeastern University. They've been given a grant to develop how to communicate, how to interpret for people with language deprivation. They have online classes, good classes. It'd be good for interpreters, good for anybody who's interested in this, for teachers, for parents, good stuff. It's a new field. It's hopeful that when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 6, that's the book that psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers use to come up with diagnoses for people with mental illnesses, emotional, personality kinds of things. We're expecting the language deprivation is going to be one of the things that will be added to that, because there's been enough research now that that's going to become one of the diagnoses. And that will be very helpful, because then it will be able to be used not just for diagnosis purpose, but for things like court cases and all kinds of things. When that's going to happen, we don't know, but it's going to be, will be a step forward. Trying to do questions and answers and things like that is difficult, and our time's about gone. But my name and phone number and email will be on the paper that, or the handout that you're going to be getting tomorrow. So please feel free to contact me, call me, email me with comments, discussion, questions, stories. There's nothing better than a good story. And we interpreters have lots of good stories. And I think it's important that we share those stories with each other. We don't have to use identifying information. I think it's important that we share that information. Doctors share information with each other. It's confidential. Nurses share information with each other. It's confidential. Interpreters need to share information with each other confidentially, because that's the way we can learn and grow and be able to provide better accommodation, better interpretation, and do a much better job to provide for people in the deaf community and the hearing community. So thank you very much. And I hope you have a good time and try to hang around with deaf people. The way I got to be good at doing this was hanging around with the folks. I didn't learn it by just sitting around and talking about it. I mixed around with people who have language deprivation, mixed around with deaf people who have good language, saw the difference, and got to be really curious and interested in what's going on with people and how much is really going on. My friend that I told you about who had no language until he was 16, he had 140 IQ. I had him tested because he was so bright. He had developed his own math system. He could do addition, subtraction, and multiplication faster than I could. He was just brilliant about all kinds of things, but he still had lots of language deprivation when it came to how to figure out a lot of different things. Don't get the two things mixed up. Mix around with people and have a good time. It's much more fun. Thank you so much. Thank you, interpreters. We love our interpreters.
This is Jen. Thank you so much, Carol.